All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tradecraft. This is the event where we share practical tips for anti-money laundering and other financial crimes investigations. Today is our first public-facing Tradecraft episode, so we're going to start with a big, broad overview, anatomy of an AML investigation. I've noticed on the poll here that many of you are already fairly knowledgeable, and quite a few people have lower levels of knowledge, so that's great. We're going to start with some of the basics, and here's our agenda, and then you can see that we will move into some deeper topics and some real practical tips, both for getting the most out of your searching, whether you're using different types of search engines or whatever on the web, and some report writing best practices. If you've just joined, make sure to answer the poll. I'll be closing it in just a couple of minutes here. But otherwise, I'm really glad to see so many folks here on a Thursday, and really happy to see that so many folks want to come and learn a little bit. My name is Rio Miner. I'm from Refined Intelligence, and I'll be giving you this briefing today. So, by the way, if you have questions or comments, you may put them in the chat window. I'm mostly going to wait until the end. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. And so feel free to put it in the chat window, or I've got Rebecca on the line. So if you can see Rebecca, you can chat to her directly, and she's going to help me manage that a little bit. So don't be shy, but I'm mostly going to wait till the end to go ahead and answer questions. All right. So Rebecca, I'm also going to close the poll now. Seems like we've got quite a few people on already, and thank you for your answers. Closing the poll there. All right, so let's talk first just a little bit about the basic AML workflow, right? So if you're one of the folks who hasn't really seen all of this before, for the most part, I'm not going to get into all of the legal requirements and all of the things that created this, but once you've determined that your institution needs to have an anti-money laundering program, that generally starts with transaction monitoring. We'll discuss what exactly that means and what are some of the main methods around that in just a moment. But suffice it to say that transactions are viewed by a system throughout whatever institution you're in. All of those transactions that are going on day after day, week after week, are alerting if they under certain criteria, and then those monitoring results become alerts, and they go into, and everybody does this a little bit differently, of course, but in general, many of these alerts will then go to some form of a triage, where basically you have to make a decision on what to do with this alert. Oftentimes the alerts are not incredibly rich, and so you have to determine whether the alert is useful, whether it needs further investigation, or some institutions even reach out directly to customers through the branch or through systems in order to kind of gain more information. That's the request for information, or RFI process. And then provided that we didn't decide that the event needed to be removed completely, and provided we didn't get a good answer from a customer on what was going on, then usually it'll move to an investigation. And the difference, in triage, usually folks are doing a little bit of like a mini investigation to understand what happened and whether or not this customer might be doing something wrong, but they don't take a lot of time on it. So once you get into the investigation stage, then folks are spending a lot of time doing different types of research, understanding the transactions that cause the alert, understanding who the customer might be and what their work is, what their income level is, things like that. And then depending on the answer that one comes up with during an investigation, you might choose to write a suspicious activity report, which is kind of the end result of all of these anti-money laundering investigations, right? That report goes to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is the government agency responsible for housing all of these reports and giving guidance around anti-money laundering programs. And then those reports can be used in various ways by law enforcement and other agencies to take action if needed. So I like to think of anti-money laundering as kind of an intelligence function, right? If you think about, we like to watch a lot of FBI shows at home. So a lot of times you see these shows where the work is divided up between analysts who are trying to kind of understand where bad guy activity might be taking place, and operators who know that there's a crime that's taken place and they go out and try to fix it. Well, in our world, I see the operators in financial crime as being kind of the fraud folks. They tend to know that there's been an actual crime committed and they're trying to gather evidence around it. Anti-money laundering is much of a softer discipline where you have to really be comfortable with vague answers, gray areas, and things that are not always going to give you a solid response. So it's more of an intelligence function, more of an analytical function around what's going on with the customer. All right, so let's talk transaction monitoring. Now, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not a transaction monitoring expert, but I've had a lot of experience working with these things. So I decided to break it down today for incredibly simple and simplistic. I know I've got some folks on the phone who are experts in this, so you can criticize me afterwards, but I'm taking this to its very simplest level, and that most transaction monitoring deals with kind of one of these few things, okay, one of these three things. So again, what is transaction monitoring? We are implementing a way for a financial institution to have a computer system review all of the transaction activity in all of the accounts throughout the institution, and then try to determine which of those are normal or legitimate versus what are anomalous or what might be suspicious or unusual, right? So the first main thing that transaction monitoring does is look for statistical anomalies. What does that mean? If you haven't taken statistics, essentially what we're doing is we're looking at kind of a baseline of activity in an account. You know, me personally, I have an account where my paycheck goes in and my bills go out, and it's kind of a certain activity level, right? So if there were to be a huge spike in that activity level, if I got a massive bonus, you know, I think my boss is on the call, so I'll wink about that. If I got a massive bonus, then that would cause a statistical anomaly because my account is not used to receiving these huge chunks of money all at one time, right? That's something that would happen within kind of a monthly look or a weekly look, where a transaction monitoring system is viewing my account and looking for that spike in a statistical spike, an anomaly. Slightly different than my historical variation, right? That's where you look at my account over the lifespan of the account, and you see that it has had, you know, maybe larger ups and downs, but the variation that happens is based on a much longer time period of viewing the account and understanding the profile of how the account is used, how the account works. Okay, and then the third one that is probably the biggest one is high risk activity. And oftentimes this revolves around cash transactions where they may not be as big of an anomaly or as big of a historical variation, but the activity is risky simply because cash is very difficult to trace. And by the way, when I say cash, I like to make a note that cash, I mean physical dollar bills, right? If you've been in the mortgage industry or you've been in some of these other industries, sometimes they say cash and they mean like guaranteed funds. Like if we say an all cash purchase on a house, nobody physically pulls out dollar bills. It means that they had the money and they wired it and they spent the money. That's not what I mean. When I say cash, when most anti-money laundering folks say cash, we mean physical banknotes, physical dollar bills. And obviously the reason for that is that those are incredibly difficult to track, right? If I walk into a bank with $9,000, I'm cross my fingers someday, that will be unusual because nobody has any idea where that came from, right? If it came as a wire or an ACH or one of these other electronic transfers, you can kind of trace how that came. Nobody knows where the cash came from. So that's why it's riskier. And then other high risk activities, you know, maybe the institution has metrics around which countries you can send wires to and which countries are too risky, or other, you know, maybe it's not a country, maybe it's a geographical region, smaller than a country, something like that. So these are three of the main types of transaction monitoring. And it's incredibly important when you are investigating one of the alerts that comes out of one of these systems that you understand how the system works, what type of anomalies the system is looking for, And therefore, you can kind of pinpoint what type of transactions in the account actually cause the alert. And then one can start the investigation with that node of, what was this? Why did this customer come in front of my investigative desk, right? Once you understand how the rules work or how the models work that create the alerts, then you can look for the actual transactions, and then you can conduct more research. So what type of research are we going to conduct? So I said, it all starts with the alert, right? Now, I understand if you're at many institutions have other ways for cases to get into the AML world. Okay, you can have a bank teller refer something, manually. There's lots of other ways to do this. Okay, so we're kind of focusing on the monitoring aspect. And when these alerts come in, it's often, I like to say transaction monitoring is a little bit of a blunt instrument, right? Transaction monitoring alerts can be, up to like 98% non-productive or false positive. So it's often that transaction monitoring is not very well dialed in. They call it tuning. It's not very well tuned to what's really going on. And there's a reason for that. Okay, so I will say that there's a really high number of false positives in transaction monitoring because it's unacceptable to miss things. So we're willing to get a huge volume of non-productive alerts or false positives in order to make sure that we've captured all of the unusual activity and we're not missing it or approaching all of the activity. So the next step, and this is where, if you saw on the agenda, I want to talk about how to create a framework or a structure for an anti-money laundering investigation. And I've always seen this as being kind of a two-part thing. And you can see I've got the circle in the middle because the two parts are not distinct. They interact with one another. So there's transaction research and there's customer research. And the goal is when you look at transaction research, you're trying to understand, what is kind of the typical pattern, what makes sense for this account and things like that, right? What do those transactions look like? What are the common transactions? What might be the unusual transactions? And then when you look at who the customer is, you are then trying to match up what you've seen in the transactions with what you can find with the customer. So do these transactions make sense, or do they seem reasonable for who this individual or who this company is? And that word reasonable is a very difficult word to baseline or to benchmark. But if you do this well and you work through it and you spend your time on it, then you can actually come up with a lot through this process. So let's look at each of these quarters here that I've put on the screen briefly. The first one is how do you get your transactions? If you're an anti-money laundering investigator, you work for a bank or another financial institution, likely you have some way to just get some kind of a spreadsheet or an internal data feed that's going to give you a large chunk of the data that you need. It's not going to be everything, but it'll give you a large chunk, right? So first off, if you're dealing with spreadsheets and you're dealing with, some kind of Excel product or some kind of similar spreadsheet product, you need to be really well versed in how to use that tool, because much of this information can be understood and digested very quickly, provided you are good at manipulating a spreadsheet. Okay, I say that as a small advertisement for future Tradecraft episodes. I will definitely be holding more episodes of this Tradecraft product, and we will be talking about some hard skills on how to manipulate data sets and stuff like that. Again, today's our first one, so we're going broad brush, and we'll finish with more practical tips in a moment. So then from those data extracts, so you're working with a spreadsheet and you're seeing transactions. Oftentimes, an investigator will then need to go to a different internal bank system in order to get more information about a transaction. So the first one up there on internal systems is check images, right? And check images is a big one because it's very often that a paper check, a personal check or a business check, the bank or the financial institution somewhere has a picture of the check, okay? And usually that is not going to make its way into a spreadsheet. It's not going to make its way into some kind of a case management system. You're going to have to go look for it. So there's a lot of things where you're going to look at the spreadsheet, and then you're going to have to go and look. You find the transactions that are interesting, the extra large transactions, the extra unusual seeming transactions, and you have to go find more information on those on the internal systems. And then you may have to go back to the data and figure out whether you want more or whether whether you got enough out of it, right? Wire details is another one. So wire transfers, electronic transfers using the Fedwire, Swift, or CHIPS network are oftentimes there's a lot of rich data in those wires, and you may or may not get all of that by using your spreadsheet. So there are originator to beneficiary information fields where people can type whatever they want. If you're looking at business wires, a lot of times there'll be file numbers, there'll be addresses for real estate purchases. So that field is incredibly important. Doesn't always show up in the spreadsheet, doesn't always come in cleanly. You're going to need to know where to get your details from your wire system internally. Additionally, the mainframe or the core system, this is usually one of those incredibly ancient systems in your institution. It probably is like a DOS matrix screen where you can't even use a mouse. Everything is coded and things like that. A lot of times there'll be other ways to see information within there. So one of the things that I used to do when I did this every day is like, let's say someone cashes a check and then deposits that money into the account as cash. The spreadsheet may only show you that it was cash, right? But you may be able to go into the mainframe or the core system and see like a second by second chronological log of what happened at that teller window. And so you may not see it in your spreadsheet, but if you look one transaction before the cash deposit, you will actually see that it was a cash check. And then you need to go find that check image, etc. So that's why on my diagram here, it goes round and round, because every piece of information you find may or may not force you to then go look up more information in order to enrich it. And then you can see that if you're doing this right, if you're spending a lot of time on those cases that matter, it can take a lot of time. This is very labor intensive, and that's why most of the institutions are hiring smart people to take lots of time to do this right. I'll make one point that I like to make about AML investigations. I call it economy of effort. In the military, we used to call it economy of force. So in the military, you would say, look, I'm not going to take my best troops and just spread them all across the operation. I want to take my best troops and I want to put them where they're going to be most effective. And in anti-money laundering investigations, this is similar to, I say, economy of effort, right? You're going to get thousands upon thousands of these transaction monitoring alerts fed into your department. Some of them are useful, some of them are not. It's important as an individual investigator that you look at your own queue of investigations and you try to sort of create a priority for yourself on what's going to take you more time and what's actually worth spending the time on. And that's a subjective decision that you'll have to make. But there's always a point where you need to stop investigating and either report or don't report, but quit going down the rabbit hole. It's incredibly important because, as you see, this cycle can just go round and round and round. And there's innumerable stories within the AML world that oftentimes if a bank hires someone who's former law enforcement, you see that person really going after each and every alert as if it's a criminal case. And it's really not. We're doing an intelligence gathering function. So you have to really weed through what's important and what's not. So that's a little side note on managing your queue. But back to this. So look, the top half shows us the transactions, right? And we're looking at our data, we're looking at our internal systems, we're going back and forth to see what we need to look at, what we want to look at, and getting more information and going back and forth. Additionally, that second half of it is the customer research, right? So who is this customer? What do they do for a living? Who is this business? What industry are they in? And then you have to kind of think beyond that and go, well, I need to know in my own head, what is reasonable for that industry? And this is one of those big challenges, right? In some ways, AML investigators have to sort of be a jack of all trades, so to speak, because you have to know a little bit about almost every industry in the world. Not incredibly easy to do, but the point is you're going to be asked to make decisions on tire companies and restaurants and corner stores and people who are millionaires and people who are living on Social Security and everything you can imagine, right? In your institution, at some point, all of these are going to come up on some kind of an anomaly because of the way transaction monitoring works with that blunt instrument. So you have to have a little bit of a guide for yourself on saying, what do I think is reasonable? What makes sense in this industry, right? And then if you don't know, you're going to have to find somebody to ask. So the way that we do that is oftentimes through one of the two things that I've listed on the bottom of the diagram, where you have some open source research, which means I can just go and look for it on my own. In the past, you would go to the records department of the local government offices and sift through the files. Today, we have these wonderful search engines. The whole interweb thingy gives us lots of access to lots of information. So we use search engines. We can go to, like in America, we can go to the Secretary of State, and each state will have business listings and different things. MLS is the real estate listing service, right? Where you can go and you can look and see whether houses were listed or sold and things like that. These things are not easy to research individually. So oftentimes financial institutions like to go towards paid services that kind of do some of this aggregation on their own, right? So it's there's a lot of companies that will go out there and scrape information from the web. They'll go out and grab all the information from the Secretary of State or from the courtroom or from the DMV, the car registry, the driver's license registry, right? They pull all those things in and they aggregate it for you. And then that gives you, an easier tool. These are expensive services, but they're very helpful, right? They pull the public records and they give it to you all at once instead of you having to go singly to all of these things. But I want to remind you that we always are going back and forth, right? So once we find out a little bit about, through open source research, whether or not, we think we understand what the customer's line of business is, well, then we might want to go back to the data a little bit and go, well, now that I know that this is a gas station, what else can I do? What do I know about gas stations? Where else can I look? Can I go to a map that'll show me an image of the actual gas station or whatever, right? And then if you can't find enough, then maybe you want to go to your paid service and pull a report. And then you see that this person owns certain things or whatever. Then you're going to want to go back to your spreadsheet and say, well, okay, now that I know this, what else did I find about it? So it's a very back and forth process, but understanding that there are these two halves of the process is incredibly important. Now, any of you who know this business, which a lot of you do, realize that there's something missing in this graph. And the thing that's missing is KYC, know your customer. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I want to launch another poll as well. How do I find my other poll? Okay, so I'm going to launch a poll asking you about your know your customer file quality. This is it's just to kind of get you thinking about it, right? Because what we understand is that when bankers open accounts, they have this requirement to know who the customer is. They have certain things called customer due diligence that are requirements, but do they do a good job? Does every 22-year-old kid who's just trying to meet that account quota really spend accurate time digging into what the customer does? I can tell you from experience, the answer is no, right? These people are trying to open accounts quickly. If the customer doesn't have information right away, they write fake information in there. So that's why I'm curious, what does yours look like? And I'm going to give this poll a second. There's another poll I missed where I'd like to know more about what are some of your favorite ways to gather new information. So I'll leave that right there for a moment. So what we understand on my first bullet is that, KYC information is not always accurate because people open accounts quickly and want to do these things fast and move on, but it's also not very up to date, right? Like my date of birth isn't going to change, but my employment changes, my income level changes, my business, all of these, so many things change, right? My marital status could change. All of these things can change. And those life story events that change throughout the life cycle of the customer really affect what it looks like from the investigative chair, right? So it's important to understand how much you can trust your know your customer files. And then you want to do the battle royale of what I see on the internet. Does that match up with what I have inside my internal system, right? And I'm finding, I'll look at the KYC file quality poll. 46% of you are saying, yeah, it's somewhat useful. 30% of you are saying it's very useful. And I've got 13% saying somewhat useful and 11% saying usually not. So look, it is tough and you're going to have to understand how well your bankers are doing this. And now you have to also kind of vet your internal information versus what you can find on the internet and compare the two, right? So there's all of this vetting that goes on. Now let's get into some practical tips for searching. I'm going to end this poll. I'm going to launch another one real quick. Because actually this is really appropriate right now. I didn't miss it. We did it right at the right time. Everything I do is at the right time when I'm in charge. Don't we all like that? So here's another poll asking about how you do your client information research, right? Are you only interested in your KYC? And by the way, this is one where you can put multiple answers. So choose all the ones that you like to do and let us know. But a lot of times we're using search engines. So let's get into the nitty gritty here. And by the way, this presentation is 8 slides long. I'm not trying to kill anybody with PowerPoint on a Thursday afternoon. So stick with me, all right? These are the practical tips. How does a search engine work? Okay, you may have never thought about this. You may think that when you go to Google or Lycos, or I have to invent like other people use other search engines, Bing, when you go to those search engines, you may think that it's searching the entire internet, but it's not. Okay, the internet is much bigger than any of us will ever know. There's more information than we can ever process. And the way search engines work is they index pages and they index the internet. Okay, so that company spends their time going out and scraping the internet for information and indexing it. So then when you search, it's only searching the things that it's indexed. It's not searching everything. If it has, and maybe they do a great job, right? Maybe they index 1 billion pages a day. Fine, great. But there's still like a quadrillion, trillion, that's not a number. There's still so much more out there. If you've ever seen the iceberg analogy, right? The web that we see is the top, and the whole thing below that is that's the deep web. There's a lot more on the web than we even know how to access. So it's a cinch that definitely these search engines are not searching everything, right? So you need to understand that when you search one search engine, you are searching what they have already indexed and nothing else. Okay, therefore it's useful to sometimes try different search engines. And what I've found is that because of this indexing idea, different search engines tend to be good for different things. So again, I know that there's one major player in this space, but one thing I noticed is that if I'm looking for like images, there's like I think Bing is sometimes a little bit better if I'm just looking for a picture than what Google does, because Google mixes in all these other results and Bing is a little more pure of just showing me pictures. So that's an interesting thing. So the point is, as one of my old mentors used to say, click something new every day. Okay, you're probably not going to break it. So try something else. Try a new search engine. Search for what other search engines are useful. Okay, I'm going to skip Boolean operators and say there's a thing called a metacrawler. A metacrawler is a search engine that searches other search engines. So there's one called Dogpile. I think Lycos may have been a metacrawler, and there's other out there. You can search for metacrawlers. So what it does is it'll search 3 or 4 search engines in the same search and then give you all those results on different pages. So this can be an incredibly useful way to go out and compare the results that you get from different search engines and make your own determination. If I'm looking for this, I want to go to this search engine, and if I'm looking for that, the other one's better. Okay, so that's a great way to understand how well your searches are actually bringing you the results you want. So let's talk about bringing you the results that you want, and that's where Boolean operators come in. So I'll tell you what Boolean operators are not. They are not special forces soldiers from the country of Boolia. The operators, no, okay. Sorry, I don't know if my jokes land because none of you guys are laughing on camera. That's fine. Boolean operators are ways to qualify your searches in order to make them more effective. So the simplest and one of the most powerful ways to do this is simply to put quotes in your search. So sometimes I do this live. I'm not going to spend the time to do it now, but if you search for my name, Rio Miner, and you leave the quotes out, you'll get a whole bunch of results about the Rio Tinto mining company and their operations in Argentina. I've never been involved with them, and I've never been to Argentina. Someday. So what's happening there? What's happening is that when you search 2 words, it's looking for any instance of Rio and any instance of miner, right? So it comes up with people who dig in the dirt. in the city of Rio or from the company Rio Tinto, right? So it's not looking for me, it's just looking for the words. When you put quotes around it, it looks for Rio Miner next to each other. So that's a very powerful way to take your quick search for an individual and make it so that you're looking for the name and not just any instance of these words. Along with that, it can be also very powerful to then narrow it down by some other qualifier. So you can put quotes around the name, and then you can put a comma, and then you can put a location or a phone number or an address or whatever you can think of. There are other things you can do. So now we're searching, Rio Miner with California, and you probably start getting photos of me, right? Because now we're looking not just for any instance of California, we're looking for this guy with this name in this place. And those searches get way more targeted. Now, by the way, you have to be careful. You can put too many qualifiers in there, okay? For example, if you were to put my middle initial in there, and middle initials mess it up more than anything, Rio H Miner, you're going to find like nothing because I never use the middle initial, right? So make sure that you're not qualifying it too much. And again, click on something new, try it differently, try it a few different ways and see what works for you. Different clients will also give you different results, right? Other Boolean operators include, you can put a minus sign. So like we could go Rio Miner minus Argentina, and then it'll get rid of all those results about the company. Or you could go, plus something else to make sure that you're always getting that other word and things like that. So those are Boolean operators. I encourage you to try the quotes, try adding other search terms, and then again, play around with it, play around with different meta-callers, right? Okay, so if I beat that dead horse enough, what I would like to do then is remind you that not everything you find, this may be surprising, not everything you find on the internet is true. Okay, so vetting sources, what does vetting mean? It means verifying that this is truth, okay? Verifying that this source is reliable and that I know that the answer I get from this source is going to be, as close to reality as possible, that it's honest, that it's not some kind of faked thing, right? So we have to, and the way that I do this most is like, it's really hard to tell, right? You know that there's some things you can trust, and that there's like, probably if I'm looking at the DMV website, I can trust that this is what I'm, that's a true record, right? A true and accurate record. But a lot of times you don't. So one great example of this is where you can look up businesses, and there's about 1 million of these little like, companies that'll give you some kind of information about the business, right? And when you do that, it's really valuable to look at like 2 or 3 different ones to make sure that you're comparing those results and that you agree that they more or less agree, so that you know that this is kind of a true result. By the way, it's if someone has a relatively common name, and you'd be surprised what names are common. You have to make sure that you're getting the right person, right? If I'm searching for John Smith, West Virginia, I have to make sure that, the 800 people that have that name in that state, that I know which one I want to ask about. So that's analyzing your results as well, right? Even if you think you have a true and accurate source, you may not have actually found the right John Smith. So that's important as well. That's where I think the KYC versus the internet can be very helpful, because if you find John Smith on the internet in West Virginia with this address, and that jives with what you find on your KYC file from your institution, now you're comparing your results, comparing your notes, and you understand, okay, this is probably the right person. And then you can kind of go down the line with that and pull that thread of information to continue to gather more information. By the way, that is one of the ways that investigation just works generally, right? Is that you use one small piece of information to gather more information, and it's like a snowball effect, that the more you find, you can glom on more things, and you get a much better complete picture of what is going on. And again, I encourage you to exercise all of the critical thinking resources at your disposal, right? Always look at the results you find with a degree of skepticism. Always consider vetting the source or comparing it to other sources, or comparing it to your internal things. You have to be incredibly critical about not just what do I see and whether or not it's true, but what does it really mean? All right. So we've got a great poll here. Thank you all for answering. I'm going to end that poll. And I have one more poll. And this is just general. It's not even related to the next slide. I probably should have launched this at the beginning. But a lot of folks, remember I mentioned that the transaction monitoring can be kind of a blunt instrument, and there's really high false positive results and things like that. So I want to launch a poll just asking you about your transaction monitoring. How much do you trust it? What are your false positives like, and things like that? You can answer that at your leisure. It's not exactly what I'm talking about next. What I want to talk about now is report writing. Okay. And I know that this is it's something that's near and dear to many people's hearts. It's very difficult to write a good report sometimes. Some of us are more adept at writing than others. Some of us are more adept at language use than others. And you know, some of us just tremble with fear every time you have to write a paper, right? So this can be a daunting task. So here are some ways that you can increase your structure to the report and make sure that it's easier for you to write, as well as easier for your audience to digest, etc. So one of my favorite things to tell people about writing is put the bottom line up front. Oh, and by the way, when I'm talking about reports, this kind of applies whether you're writing a suspicious activity report that goes to the government, or if you're writing a not suspicious report that's just going to end up in your file system, right? There are many different times when you're going to have to write different reports and write these things to people. So yes, this is focused a little bit on like a suspicious activity report or a SAR narrative, right? That's kind of what I'm talking about here, but you can apply these principles to lots of other things. So here we go. Bottom line up front. This is another thing that I absorbed from the military, where it's like, look, and I taught my spouse this as well. When writing an email in particular, and it applies to the case structure, but let me talk about the email. When writing an email, look, I read email on my phone, right? And I can't always see the whole email. And if you don't grab my attention in the first sentence, I'm probably moving on. Okay. And what I find that my spouse does is she'll, you know, explain the question. Like, I really need to understand something that's been going on. So, and at the end of the paragraph, she's actually asking the question. And I said, no, that's not how you do it. You put the question as the first sentence, and then you explain why you want to know, or you explain more detail around the context of the question. But putting the question up front allows the person to understand why I want to keep reading. Okay. And this is how I was also taught to write a SAR narrative. I wrote, you know, thousands of these in my time as an investigator. And I've been to dozens of presentations by consumers of SAR information, law enforcement agencies, IRS, FBI, whatever, and they all say similar things, okay? So it's incredibly important that you put the reason for the report up front. This person did this and it was suspicious and we think it's related to crime X, okay? So that's important. Put that at the top, because otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to get somebody to read all the way through. And I personally, I don't know if it's, you know, I don't know what it is, but my attention span has gotten shorter and shorter over time. So I've noticed that, you know, I have much less patience for reading through a bunch of information before I understand why I'm reading it, right? So if you don't put the bottom line up front, nobody's going to read your SAR unless they're really, really already interested in it. So have a structure, right? My structure was always that we would put this kind of bottom line, very short paragraph. So-and-so did this and it was suspicious because of this. And then I would kind of explain chronologically what happened. So, you know, on this date, this money moved, and then on this date, this money moved, etc. So, and then at the end, I would have a conclusion paragraph where I kind of restate the thesis, right? It's just good writing, you know, essay 101. You restate, yeah, remember this was suspicious and we think it's related to this. And then how can you contact the institution to find out more? Okay, so that structure, introduction that tells you why it's important, chronological details so that it's easy to follow, and then a conclusion wrap-up paragraph. That was my structure. And having a structure like that not only helps me save time as an investigator, because I don't have to figure out, you know, how do I want to actually kind of phrase this particular report. I know every time I'm doing it this way. It also increases understanding for your readers, right? So let's talk about who your readers are. You got to know your audience. So all of these SARs, they go into the FinCEN database. And if a law enforcement person or some agent who has access to the database pulls that SAR out, they actually get this horrible document that has it's all caps, regardless of how you send it in, it comes out all caps, and there are no paragraphs, there's very little punctuation, it's all kind of just run together, all caps. You can imagine how impossible that is to read. So do I need to say again that we should probably put the bottom line up front? Because again, these folks are reading, hundreds, if not thousands of SARs over and over and over, and they just don't have time to dig all the way through every single one. If you don't grab my attention at the top, I'm probably going to move on to the next one. So their perspective, another thing I like to say is that there's kind of two different ways that law enforcement tends to use SARs. Is that one way is that they use it as a way to, the primary way that I think people use it, and this is just kind of my opinion, is that they will query the database when they have an ongoing investigation to see if there's any financial crime information in the database, right? So if I'm, trying to go nail John Smith for drug dealing and I can't seem to find him on the street with drugs, maybe I can go look in the SAR database and see if he's moving drug money, and money laundering. I can start with that as a prosecution. So that's a thing. The other way to do it is reactive use, right? Where they have these SAR review committees where a whole bunch of agencies will get in a room once a month with and just literally print these out and hand them out to different agencies based on what they're about, right? So from that sense, then people are actually initiating investigation based on the fact that they saw the SAR and they were like, ooh, millions of dollars unexplained, let's do an investigation. So proactive use, reactive use, where proactive use allows me to gather intel on my perp so that I can have a better way to nail them. Whereas reactive use is like, oh, I saw a SAR that was interesting, let's open something. Okay, so knowing your audience is important. Understanding who are your consumers of this information and what are they looking for, right? That's why we need to make sure that we state facts, but we also state opinions. And I think this is incredibly important. A lot of people will be like, no, just the facts, ma'am, right? That's the old dragnet line. But just the facts is actually not what we want. We don't pay analysts to just repeat facts. I can probably create a bot that does that. What I really need out of that analyst, out of that intelligence function, is to add your opinion to the fact, okay? Now, the key is you can't state your opinion as if it's fact. You can't say this is this. You do need to caveat it as an opinion. So you state your facts, and then you say, what do you think it means, okay? We tend to pay people for their analysis, okay? The analysis is what is so important for the human person to look at all the data and provide what they think might be the answer. And that answers the question, so what, right? In a lot of intelligence shops that I've worked in, there's a big so what sign on the wall. Look, if we're writing a report, it's got to answer the question, so what? Why did you write this report? Now, look, I know everybody's got to write simple structuring SARs that they hate because you don't really know what it is and you don't really have an opinion about it. It's just we have mandatory reporting. That's not what I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking about the reports where you have a little bit more context and you actually do have a theory on what this might be or why this was suspicious or why it was unusual. So make it useful by giving your opinion. Make sure that you delineate that this is an opinion, like X, Y, and Z are facts. The person moved this money. It went from here to here. That's a fact. Why did they do it? Now you're opining and you need to say, I believe, or something like that in order to caveat that this is an opinion. All right. So my comments on report writing are really the end of this. I'm going to end our poll on transaction monitoring productivity, and someone outside the door is upset that I ended that poll. I'm so sorry. So what I would like to do now is just take a couple of moments to see if anyone has any questions. Rebecca, I'm not sure if you got any questions on the chat window. I'm not able to see it right now based on the way my screen is going.
I did get a couple questions.
Great.
And if you can't hear me, just tell me and I'll send it over to you in chat. But the first question is, can an investigator directly reach out to the customer, or does he have to go through the branch? What is the best practice?
Yeah, great question. Personally, I would never want someone reaching out to a customer directly from an investigative chair. I think that puts the investigator at risk, right? We're looking for money laundering. Who money launders? Bad people, right? So if you decide you want to email a cartel guy and say, why'd you do a bunch of $9,000 deposits? You're putting yourself at risk. It's a bank policy thing. It's about your appetite. So if you have a way to mask yourself, that can be incredibly useful. But most of the time, the best practice that I've seen, mid-sized banks tend to do this by sort of emailing someone at the branch or a relationship manager and having the business-facing person reach out directly, and then sending that information back to the, playing the telephone game and sending it back to the investigator. The other way I've seen this done at some of the larger institutions is that they have call centers that'll do it for you as well. So you send a note to the call center, somebody there has an outbound call. And a lot of people don't do it at all, right? In one of my early jobs, I always used to wish I could just ask somebody what was going on, and there wasn't a method for it. So there you go. Any other questions?
Yes, actually, someone just put into the chat, I think it's in relation to something you just said, which was that you can't, it's not a really question, you can't tip off anyone regarding a SAR investigation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, tipping off is a major concern, right? So I mentioned it from the perspective of, if I'm an investigator, I don't want to expose myself to a potential criminal, but more importantly, you really need to be careful how you ask those questions, because it can't be a financial crime sounding question, right? It has to be that it sounds like the bank just needs to understand what you're doing, but you can't let them know that there's actually an AML alert behind it. You can't let them know that they're going to maybe be reported to the government. And by the way, suspicious activity reports are a secret document, so they're not admissible in court. They're not allowed to be shared. Someone can't even know about the existence of a SAR if you didn't write it or if you weren't involved in creating it. So SARs are secret. Yeah, it's important, if you don't know this, that I can initiate an investigation based on a SAR, but if I want to use the evidence in court, I've got to send a subpoena to the bank and get the information through the subpoena process. I can't use the SAR information in court. So not tipping off the customer to the existence of a SAR is incredibly important. And again, that's why I would recommend that you don't reach out directly to customers. That would be bad on a variety of fronts. Thanks for the comment.
Okay, so there's another question here. Any suggestions on time management during the investigation and writing process?
Yeah, wow, yeah. So I mentioned the economy of effort thing, right? I think one of the things is that big picture, you have to look at your entire investigative queue. What do I have to do this week? What do I have to do next week? And you have to kind of do a mini triage for yourself on which of these are going to take me more time and which of these might take me less time. Now, you can't always predict, but there are indicators, right? A case with 50 accounts and 10 people is going to take you longer to research than a case with one person, one account. So that's one thing, right? Is you can kind of say, okay, well, let me batch these simple cases and do them as fast as possible. And then let me take a little more time to work on the longer cases after I've gotten rid of a bunch of this simple stuff. That's one way to do it. Another way is it's kind of just, well, look, Boolean operators are going to help you because they'll help you target your searches. You'll spend less time moving around and looking through the web space trying to figure out. Also, I would recommend, I mentioned a structure to your investigation, right? So I would recommend for yourself understanding that I simply do things in a similar order each time. I start with the same few steps, and then I let the investigation take me where I want to go. So creating that structure for yourself, because a lot of times your department's not going to create a checklist for you. That's a bad approach. They want to let you go out and be creative, right? So they'll give you that, and they won't give you that, and you need to give it to yourself. So I would always start with, okay, what was the alert? Do I understand that alert? And then can I find that action, that targeted activity, and then I work outward from there. It's like, I call it the bubble method, right? So I find the alerted activity, I understand the bank KYC profile or the bank customer profile, and I start with that. Sometimes I can eliminate the case just looking at those things, but if it requires more research, then I usually would look at customer information first, because I prefer not to look at the transactions don't speak to me as much as the customer. So once I figure out who that person is or who that business is, then I go back and look at the transactions. Other people's brains work differently, right? So remember that you kind of have these two major chunks of the investigation. Decide for yourself in advance what your first few steps are each time, and then you can work outward from there. Also, there is a balance between making sure you vet every piece of information and every source that you find, and not doing too much research. So you kind of want to do, I don't like saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. You kind of want to do the minimum necessary on most cases. But what I mean by that is, you still need to provide reasonable justification for everything you're finding. But look, if you think you know the answer and you've got several pieces of evidence that you think solidify that answer, don't keep digging. This is not a full-on investigation. Again, remember that what we're really doing is creating an intelligence tip that law enforcement may or may not use, right? So if you gather enough information to say, I think this is suspicious, I think I've got enough here to give a decent tip to law enforcement, stop and keep going, or stop and report, right? Because, and of course, by the way, nothing I say should be taken as you having license to push back on your boss or your procedures or whatever. Okay, if you're in a position where you can make decisions, you can help write better procedures. But if you're just a line investigator, please listen to your manager first. Every institution has different types of standards, different levels of detail that they need, and that's based on a risk appetite. But the more you create a structure and kind of a template for yourself, you'll know each time I'm going to go through step 1 through 5, and then I'm going to see what I found and look outward from there. Hopefully that helps. What
Thanks,
else?
Rio.
We've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, so I don't think this will take the full 10 minutes, but you never know. What is the percentage of alerts that end up as a SAR? and in follow-up to that, how long is a piece of string? No, I'm sorry, just kidding.
How long is a piece of string? There's a whole Monty Python sketch about pieces of string. You should go watch that. What was the first question?
The real question was, what is the percent of alerts that end up as a SAR?
Yeah, so I would go back to our poll on that. It is oftentimes a very, very small percentage, right? So we have seen that industry-wide, 95% false positive or 95% non-SAR is like a great number to a lot of people, okay? Some departments are dealing with like 98% is going to no SAR, and only 2% or 1% is going to an actual suspicious activity report. So, I mean, it is a really low number compared to the volume of alerts. And that's why AML departments struggle to do this, right? That's why we do webinars like this, to try to give you just a few tools in your kit bag to be able to do that investigation, 3 clicks faster, 5 minutes faster, and hopefully get through it and find the real bad guys.
Okay. It looks like there's a follow-up question to this, which is, who sets the standard for SAR narrative? Is there any requirement from FinCEN?
FinCEN has given out guidelines, and I haven't been on their website recently to look at what the most recent guidance is. In the past, I've also received some fairly good information in the form of presentations and briefings from the IRS, who has a lot of really good opinions about how to write a good SAR narrative. But to my knowledge, your institution is going to internally set the standard for that. So I was fortunate that the person that taught me how to write a SAR had the structure that I described to you. And it's very similar to some of the federal law enforcement agency structure. So I think that was why we did it that way, was that he had been in federal law enforcement, and that was the way they wrote their reports. So then we started writing our reports that way, because we knew that our consumers would kind of recognize the format. So I think that's something you probably want to discuss internally and figure out ways to make sure you're getting just the right amount of information in there without writing a bunch of extraneous garbage. Anything else? We've got about
Actually, yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny. The closer we're getting to the top of the hour, the questions are coming in faster. So here's another question. Should also, by the way, if everyone takes a look at the chat, I know some people have been sending not just so much questions, but comments, other ideas to everybody. So feel free to take a look at that. I won't read them out loud.
I can't see the chat right now. I'm definitely
Right.
going to go back and look at those afterwards, and I really appreciate all the input. So yeah, what do we have for a question?
Okay. Should the transaction alert reviews only cover the alerted activity, or should the review cover a specific time period? Thank you. Very polite question.
So I can't tell you what that time period should be. What I do and what I recommend is that you start with the alerted activity and you do review all the rest of the activity around it, because there's a lot of richness in the data, and you can see a lot of stuff about a person and learn about their habits just by reviewing their debit card transactions, their ACH transactions, their checks, whatever. So you definitely need to look beyond the alerted activity. There's a risk-based approach to this on how much you should look away from there and what your time period should be. And so the answer, I'm not going to give you a standard, but the answer is the higher the risk of the case, the more you need to extend your timeline and look further back, okay? Additionally, if you can't figure out what's going on with the limited amount of information, the most current information, you may need to look back farther just because you need to see more about like what was the source of funds, where did this money come from, things like that. So I won't give you a time frame. I will say, yes, you almost always need to look a little bit beyond the alerted activity. And in particular, so here's one thing. People, I remember they used to filter the spreadsheets and filter out low dollar amount transactions. I recommend that if you do that, you also then go back and look at it with the low dollar amounts in there. Because once again, like I've had so many instances where I was able to watch somebody travel. I could see what their diet was like. I could see, all of their habits. And that really helps me understand a complete picture of the subject of the investigation. What else?
So here's another question, Rio, about cash structuring. Do you have to terminate an account if you see the client doing it? What is the best practice?
Yeah, so there's not necessarily a have to there. It's more about the implication of what's going on. So cash structuring, right? The currency transaction report is kind of the foundation of US money laundering law. It means that if you deposit, withdraw, or transact with more than $10,000 in hard currency, physical cash, then you have to file this CTR report with the IRS or with FinCEN. And so when you do that, the information goes to FinCEN and it sits there. If you decide you don't want to file that form and you're trying to make your transactions just underneath $10,000, we call that structuring. Okay, and so structuring by itself is technically a crime. It's very hard to prove because it's based on intent, right? Did I intend to avoid the report, or was $9,000 all I had? We don't really know all the time. So do you have to kick somebody out because you think they're structuring or you believe they're structuring? You don't necessarily have to. But if you're going to write a SAR on somebody for structuring, and then you're going to write another one, and then you're going to write another one, at some point, a bank regulator or an institutional regulator might come back to you and say, if you think this is suspicious activity, why do you keep banking them? Right? So at some point, the volume of times that you have to report on the same person for doing the same thing gets pretty large. And so you make a risk-based decision to get rid of that person because they persist in not following the law. There's other ways to do it. There's actually, FinCEN has a PDF pamphlet or a physical paper pamphlet that you can hand to a customer that tells them what the CTR requirement means and why structuring is a crime. It gives them examples. They produce that because it's perfectly okay for the bank to give that to a person. Again, a lot of the bigger banks just don't do it. They will just exit people because of structuring, and some of the mid-sized banks do a little more to try to retain that customer if possible. Both are acceptable. It's partly about your risk appetite.
All right, Rio, you're going to have to talk fast. So here's another question. I know anyone who doesn't get their question answered, I'm sure Rio would be happy to be in touch with you later.
Absolutely.
Right, Rio?
I'm going to look at all of this.
Have you Have you leveraged 314B request in the past to aid your AML investigations?
Yeah, you bet. So 314B is a section number of the USA Patriot Act. It's the ability for a bank to ask another bank a question regarding an AML or terrorism financing investigation. It's funny because you still can't ask them or let them know that there's a suspicious activity report, but you can ask a variety of questions. Some problems with the 314B process is that it is voluntary. So banks only register if they find it in their interest to do so. And there's no procedure around how long it's going to take them to respond or whether or not they do respond. They may register and just never respond. So it can be very difficult to get a response to a 314B in a timely manner. Some institutions do it really well, some don't. So a lot of times the way that I've used it is if I want to submit a 314B to another institution to try to understand more about the source of funds or the customer profile, I expect that I'm not going to get that back until I do my 90-day review investigation, which if you're not familiar, when you write a SAR, you have to reinvestigate in 90 days to see if the activity continued. So a lot of times I'll submit the 314B, I'll submit the SAR, and then I know I'm not going to get the information until next time I investigate. So, hey, I think that's all we have time for. Rebecca, I'm going to stop you before you ask me another question. What I would like to do is, hey, you guys have seen my information on the screen for far too long now. Please feel free to connect with me, ask me more questions on that. Let me know if your institution is having issues you think that our company can maybe help with. Again, this isn't an advertisement, so I'm not going to talk about that right now, but Refine Intelligence, we are a new startup. So go ahead and look us up and see if you think we can work together. But I'm more than happy to continue providing information. If you would like a certificate for today's lecture so that you can put that in your files to help with your annual training requirements, either send us an email or let me know somehow. We will get you a certificate for this presentation. And that is about it. What did I miss? Anything I missed? Okay. Well, again, I'm just blown away by the participation here today. It's been a pleasure presenting to you today. I hope you found this useful. If you have comments, questions, or ideas for me, again, please feel free to get in touch. And I look forward to seeing folks in the future. Thank you very much. This has been Tradecraft, and we will be sending you more opportunities to get more detailed training on hard skills for the business of anti-money laundering and financial crimes investigations. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.